My name is Sylvia Holt. I am 34 years old, and for 11 years I have written goals for children the rest of the world had already stopped trying to understand. Here is the part one still have trouble saying out loud in the right order. On a Tuesday morning in October, I sat in a courtroom in Flagstaff, Arizona, and listened to my mother-in-law tell a judge that I was not a fit mother. She said it in a voice that did not shake. She said it like she had rehearsed it in the car. And she was almost right about one thing: I was not the mother she thought she was dealing with. But here's what none of them knew. 2 weeks before that hearing, I had already been to the Coconino County Superior Court clerk's office. I had already pulled the file. I had already found, on page 11 of a guardianship petition with my name typed at the top, a signature that was supposed to be mine and was not. Welcome back to my Chanel, where the quietest person in the room always has the longest memory. If you have ever had someone try to take something from you using the exact language of love, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. To explain how I ended up sitting across from my son's grandmother in a courtroom instead of at her Thanksgiving table, I have to go back almost a year, to a July morning when my husband's boots were still by the door and the house still smelled like his aftershave. I have been a special education teacher at Sinagua Elementary for 11 years. Before that I did my student teaching in a self-contained classroom in Winslow, 45 minutes each way on a road that floods in monsoon season, because nobody else wanted the placement and I did. I have written more individualized education plans than I can count. I know what a present level of performance paragraph is supposed to say and what it is supposed to hide. I know the difference between an accommodation and a modification, and I know that most of the adults who fight hardest against giving a child either one have never once sat in a room and watched what happens to a 7-year-old when nobody gives him either. I married Marcus Holt 9 years ago, in the backyard of his mother's house in Sedona, under a ramada his father built before he died. Marcus is a staff sergeant in the Arizona National Guard, and when he is not deployed he installs solar arrays for a company out of Cottonwood, the kind of steady, sunburned work that leaves sawdust and silicone sealant under his fingernails no matter how hard he scrubs. He is quiet in the way some men are quiet because they were raised by someone loud enough for 2 people, and his mother, Stacy Plum, has never in my presence lowered her voice when she could raise it instead. Our son, Eli, is 9. He was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at 3, after a birth injury that left him with mild cerebral palsy on his left side, a shoulder dystocia the delivering physician mismanaged, according to the malpractice claim we filed when Eli was 5, the one that eventually settled for $180,000, structured into a special needs trust that pays out for his therapies, his equipment, and eventually his adult support services, administered by a trustee neither Marcus nor I are, by design, allowed to touch directly. I want to be honest about what that money represented in our house. It was not a windfall. It was the only insurance my son had against a future where his parents might not always be there to advocate for him. I had read enough special needs trust paperwork for other families' children to insist on structuring ours the same careful way. Our house sits on a quiet cul-de-sac off Cedar Avenue on the west side of Flagstaff, close enough to campus that we hear the marching band practice on fall afternoons, close enough to the mountain that in winter the ponderosa pines out back hold snow for days after the streets have cleared. It is a small house, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen too narrow for 2 people to work in comfortably, a porch where Marcus and I have had most of our real conversations over the years, coffee going cold in our hands while the sky did whatever high desert thing it does at 6 in the morning. We bought it the year Eli turned 2, right after his diagnosis, specifically because the school district lines fed into Sinagua, where I already worked, and because the guest room had good afternoon light for the kind of visual schedules and sensory breaks his early interventionists recommended. Every choice we made about that house, in other words, was made with my son's future already sitting at the table. Stacy Plum is 61. She raised Marcus and his younger sister alone after her husband died young, working the front desk at a motel on Route 89A for 18 years before she retired on a pension that does not stretch as far as she needs it to. I want to give her the moment she is owed, because even now, knowing everything I know, I believe it is true. Stacy grew up in a trailer outside Cottonwood with a mother who drank and a string of men who did not stay, and she has spent her whole adult life terrified of ending up back in a version of that house. She has told me, more than once, in a voice with no performance in it at all, that the scariest thing she can imagine is being old and having nobody decide anything on her behalf. I think some part of what happened started there, in that fear, long before it became about my son. I want to be honest about something else, because it matters for what comes later. I liked Stacy, for most of the 9 years I knew her before any of this happened. She taught me how to make her son's favorite green chili stew the first Christmas we were together, standing shoulder to shoulder at her stove while it filled the kitchen with the smell of roasted poblano and cumin, and she never once, in 9 years, missed calling on Eli's birthday, even the year she had pneumonia. I am telling you this not to soften what she did, but because the version of this story that makes her a cartoon from the very first scene would be a lie, and I did not build this file on lies. I built it on dates. When Marcus's deployment orders came through in July, 9 months, Djibouti, training partner forces, nothing especially dangerous but nothing especially short either, Stacy offered to move into our guest room just until he's back, to help me manage Eli's schedule. I said yes. I want to be honest about that decision too, because it is the first thing I got wrong. I said yes because 11 months of solo parenting a child with a rigorous therapy schedule sounded impossible alone, and because Stacy had never, in 9 years, given me a specific reason to say no. Charming, at first, is not a strong enough word. She brought over a rotisserie chicken the day she moved in and said, "You just teach your babies and love on my grandbaby. I'll handle the rest." She smelled like the same drugstore rose perfume she'd worn since I met her, and for the first few weeks the house smelled like that instead of like Marcus, and I told myself that was fine. That was just a season changing. The first red flag was so small I nearly missed it. In August, Eli's occupational therapist called to reschedule a session, and Stacy told her, without checking with me, that Tuesdays don't work for us anymore and moved it to a day I had a staff meeting. When I asked her about it, she said, "I didn't want to bother you at work, honey. I'm handling it." I let it go. Handoff report voice, flat and clear, no adjectives in it. I simply told her going forward, "Please text me before changing anything on Eli's schedule." She said of course. She did it again in September. I want to admit something here, because it is the first of a few moments I am not proud of. Part of me was relieved. Solo parenting a child with a demanding therapy calendar while grading IEP progress reports at 11 at night is exhausting in a way that does not show up on the outside, and for 2 or 3 weeks in late August, some tired, worn-down part of me thought, let her handle it, just for now. I almost let the whole thing go simply because I was too depleted to hold the line. I think that is worth saying plainly, because the version of this story where I caught everything immediately, sharp and suspicious from day one, is not the true version. The true version is that exhaustion is exactly the door people like Stacy know how to walk through. Through September, the small incidents kept arriving the way small incidents do, not as one obvious wrong turn, but as a slow accumulation of decisions made just slightly outside the boundary of where they belonged. She switched Eli's pediatrician's after-hours contact number to her own cell phone in case you're in a meeting, something I only discovered because the office called to confirm it and I had never authorized the change. She began referring to Eli's IEP meetings, in front of his classroom aide, as our meetings, a small collapsing of pronouns that I noticed and let pass, because correcting it out loud in front of a school employee felt, at the time, like airing family laundry I wasn't ready to air. She told our next-door neighbor, an older man named Walt Pruitt who has lived on Cedar Avenue longer than we have owned the house, that she was Eli's guardian while his daddy's overseas, and Walt mentioned it to me over the fence one Saturday, good-natured, no idea he'd handed me anything, just making conversation while he watered his junipers. I stood there with the hose running cold water over my own feet where I'd let it drift and said, as evenly as I could manage, "I'm still his guardian, Walt. She's just staying with us." He laughed and said he figured as much, and went back to his junipers, and I went inside and wrote the date on a sticky note I hid in my sock drawer, because I did not yet trust myself to know what any of it meant, only that it needed to be written down somewhere. The second flag came from Eli himself, the way the truest ones usually do. He told me, unprompted, while I was cutting his sandwich into the 4 triangles he requires, that Grandma Stacy had told him Mommy gets tired a lot and that maybe he could live at Grandma's house sometimes so Mommy could rest. I remember exactly where I was standing, at the counter, knife in hand, radio playing low from the windowsill, when a small cold feeling moved through my chest that I did not yet have a name for. I asked him, careful to keep my voice as unremarkable as the question itself, what he thought about that idea, and he said, without looking up from his plate, I don't want to. I like my room. I told him he never had to leave his room, that I would always tell him the truth about where he lived, and he nodded and went back to eating, satisfied in the specific literal way he is always satisfied by a direct answer, while I stood at the counter with a butter knife in my hand feeling something in my chest tighten that would not fully loosen again for 2 months. I did not sleep well that whole week. I want to be honest about that too. There were nights I lay next to the empty half of the bed, Marcus's pillow still faintly holding the shape of his head from the last morning before he deployed, and I let myself cry exactly as much as I allowed myself, 10 minutes, no more, timed almost the way I time a sensory break in my classroom, because I had a full day of other people's children waiting for me in the morning regardless of what was unraveling in my own house. The third flag had a name attached to it, and the name was Renata Delgado. Renata is the front desk coordinator at Eli's pediatric neurology practice in Flagstaff, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses always pushed up into gray hair and a memory for faces that has caught more insurance fraud than half the auditors in the county. In late September she called me, her voice careful in that particular way people use when they are about to hand you something they know will hurt. Mrs. Holt, she said, I want to check something with you directly. We received a records request last week for Eli's full chart, going back to his birth injury workup, requested by a Stacy Plum, who listed herself as co-guardian. I didn't release anything, because our file only lists you and Mr. Holt as legal guardians. I wanted you to know before I sent the denial letter. I sat very still in my classroom that afternoon, in the 15 minutes between when my aide took my last group to specials and when the bell would ring, and I felt something shift in my chest that was not yet fear. It was closer to the feeling you get grading a test and realizing the answer key is wrong, not the student. I called Marcus that night, on the 12-hour time difference, his voice thin and staticky over the connection. I told him what Renata had said. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said the thing I will always remember him for, even with everything that came after. That doesn't sound like her being helpful. That sounds like her building a file. My husband, half a world away, in a chow hall I could hear clattering behind him, understood before I let myself fully understand, because he had grown up watching his mother build files on people. He had just never expected to be one of the people. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it is the part that is hardest to admit. I did not confront her. Not yet. I told myself I needed to be sure. I told myself that accusing Stacy Plum of trying to take my son, out loud, without proof, in a house she was currently living in, was the kind of thing you could not walk back once you had said it. So instead I did what I do every day at work when a parent tells me something doesn't add up and a file somewhere holds the answer. I started documenting. If you have ever had a family member try to rewrite your life while smiling at you across the dinner table, tell me in the comments. I promise you are not the only one, and I promise it gets easier to see once you stop asking them to explain themselves and start asking the paper instead. I kept a folder, an actual manila folder, the kind I use for IEP documentation, tucked inside a filing cabinet at school instead of at home, because some instinct I could not name told me not to keep it under my own roof. Into it went the date and time of every schedule change Stacy made without asking me. A screenshot Renata sent me, at her own initiative and against her better professional judgment, of the records request with Stacy's handwriting on it, the words co-guardian, per family arrangement in blue pen. A note from Eli's OT about the missed and rescheduled sessions. The date Eli told me about living at Grandma's house sometimes. The sticky note from the conversation with Walt Pruitt over the fence. And, underneath all of it, a printout I had pulled from the Coconino County Superior Court's online case search one lunch period, using nothing more than Eli's name and my own, a habit born purely of the same anxious thoroughness that makes me check every IEP compliance date twice. I labeled the folder tab the same neutral way I label every student file I have ever kept, E. Holt, documentation. Nobody glancing through my filing cabinet would think twice about it, which was exactly the point. I have spent 11 years learning that the safest place to keep something you are not ready to explain is inside a system nobody thinks to question, and my classroom filing cabinet, gray and dented and older than some of my students, was that system. Some evenings after the buses left, I sat at my own desk with the door propped for the custodian and added a single new page, dated it, and locked the drawer again, and the sound of that lock catching, a small, particular click, cheaper and lighter than a deadbolt but somehow just as final to my ear, became, without my ever deciding it should, the sound I associated with feeling like I was doing something instead of only being afraid. If you have ever had to keep a quiet file on someone in your own house while still setting their coffee cup out every morning, tell me in the comments. I think there are more of us than anyone admits at Thanksgiving. There was a case filed 6 weeks earlier. In re the guardianship of a minor, Eli M. Holt. Petitioner, Stacy Plum. I did not open the full file that day. I could not. I sat in my classroom with the door locked during my lunch period, a half-eaten sandwich going stale on wax paper, and I felt the particular kind of fear that has no adrenaline in it, only weight. I have felt it before, in parent meetings where a mother realizes for the first time that her son's school placement is not a suggestion but a decision already made without her. I had simply never felt it from the other side of the table. I called Margaret Osei that afternoon. Margaret is not a family lawyer by specialty, she handles special education due process hearings, the kind of legal work that exists specifically because school districts sometimes decide, on paper, what is best for a child without asking the person who knows him. I had used her twice, years earlier, to fight for Eli's services when the district tried to reduce his OT minutes, and both times she had walked into a room full of administrators holding nothing but a legal pad and a pen and left having gotten every minute she asked for. Margaret is 55, wears her gray hair in a single low braid regardless of the occasion, keeps a small cactus on the corner of her desk that she has somehow kept alive for 11 years despite what she calls a genuinely hostile relationship with houseplants, and has a habit of taking her glasses off entirely before she says something she wants you to actually hear. Her office is above a bakery on San Francisco Street downtown, and the whole waiting room smells permanently of cinnamon and printer toner, an oddly comforting combination I have never encountered anywhere else. I sat in that waiting room the day I first called her about the petition, my hands wrapped around a coffee cup I had bought from the bakery downstairs purely to have something to hold, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that a building that smells like that could not possibly be where the worst part of my year started to turn. Sylvia, she said, once I had explained everything in the flat, sequenced way I explain any file, I do family guardianship work too, on the side, because half of my due process clients end up needing it eventually. I want you to hear this clearly. If there is a pending guardianship petition with your name on the signature line that you did not sign, that is not a family disagreement. That is a forged legal document filed with a court. That changes everything about how careful, and how fast, we need to be. She took her glasses off. Here's what I need you to do. Do not confront her yet. Do not let her know you know. We are going to go get the full file, certified, from the clerk, and we are going to find out exactly what she filed and exactly what she is asking that court to give her. Everything after that depends on what's actually in it. That was the permission I needed. Not permission to be angry, I did not need anyone's permission for that, but permission to move, methodically, the way I had been taught to move through any dispute that would eventually need to hold up in a room with witnesses in it. The following Thursday, on my lunch break, I drove to the Coconino County Courthouse on Birch Avenue, the old stone building with the flag that never seems to stop moving in that particular Flagstaff wind, and paid $11 for a certified copy of the full guardianship petition. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward, engine off, and read it front to back. The building smelled the way old public buildings always do, floor wax and paper dust and the ghost of 1,000 cups of bad coffee, And none of that mattered once I got to page 11. The petition asked the court to grant Stacy Plum co-guardianship of Eli, citing, in careful legal language clearly drafted by someone who knew what phrases a judge responds to, concerns regarding the primary custodial parent's demanding professional schedule and the child's need for a stable, consistent caregiving presence during the father's extended military deployment. It cited, without naming her directly, documented irregularities in medical appointment attendance, the very rescheduling Stacy herself had caused. And on page 11, at the bottom, beneath a paragraph stating that both parents consented to co-guardianship being explored in the child's best interest, was a signature. Sylvia R. Holt. I have signed my name several thousand times in my life, on IEPs, on report cards, on grocery store receipts. I know the particular slant of my own R, the way I cross my H without lifting the pen. The signature on page 11 was close. It was close enough that a busy clerk stamping 50 documents a day would never look twice. It was not mine. The T in Holt was crossed the way Stacy crosses hers. I had watched her sign birthday cards for 9 years. I sat in that parking lot with the certified copy in my lap and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, the way it does right before I walk into a difficult IEP meeting, the calm that isn't calm, just readiness wearing calm's clothes. Tucked behind the signature page was a supplemental filing I had not expected, a petition to establish Stacy as co-trustee of Eli's Special Needs Trust, to ensure continuity of financial oversight during the guardianship transition period. The trust, Eli's $180,000, the money that existed for exactly one purpose, to protect my son when neither of his parents could, had a dollar figure attached to it in Stacy's own filing, and a request that future disbursements require her signature alongside the trustees. That was the moment I understood this was never about worry. This was about access. I called Margaret from the courthouse parking lot before I had even started the car. My voice, when I described what I'd found, was the voice I use giving a discharge-level handoff to a substitute, flat, sequenced, no adjectives in it, because if I let one adjective in I was not sure which one would come out first. I didn't raise my voice, I told her, and I meant it as fact, not virtue. I don't think I have it in me to raise my voice about this. I think if I start, I won't stop, so I'm not going to start. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That's going to serve you better than you know, she said. Judges remember the parent who stayed level. They remember the other party too, usually for the opposite reason. We built the case slowly, over 3 weeks, the way you build any case that has to survive being read by a stranger who has never met the people in it. Margaret subpoenaed the notary log from the office where the petition had been notarized, a UPS store on Milton Road, where the clerk on duty, a young man named Devin who could not have been older than 22, had notarized the signature after Stacy told him she was just witnessing my daughter-in-law's own paperwork, she's swamped with the kids. Devin had no independent recollection of ever seeing me in his store, because he never had. His notary log showed a single entry that day under my name, at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday when my school's sign-in sheet, kept, ironically, for exactly this kind of accountability, the same sign-in sheet the district makes every staff member use, showed I was in my classroom running a math small group until 3:15. That sign-in sheet became, without either of us planning it, the second document in what Margaret started calling the file, and I started calling, privately, the paper trail. The phrase feels almost too dramatic for how ordinary it actually was. A time card. A notary log. A pediatric neurology records request with handwriting on it. A certified copy of a petition with a forged signature and a dollar amount attached. None of it was dramatic on its own. All of it, laid side by side, told a story no explanation could survive. There was a night, near the end of that 3rd week, when I almost gave up on doing this quietly at all. Eli had a hard evening, a meltdown after a change in his after-school routine, screaming that dissolved eventually into exhausted crying on the bathroom floor while I sat beside him, not touching him, just present, the way his OT taught me, and afterward I sat on the edge of the tub with my head in my hands and thought, clearly and simply, I could just tell her I know. I could scream at her tonight and end this tonight. I want to be honest about how close I came. It would have felt like relief, for about 4 minutes, and then it would have handed her exactly the story she needed: an unstable, screaming mother, a house in chaos, a grandmother forced to step in. I sat on that tub edge until the urge passed, the way you sit through a contraction, and then I got up and made Eli's lunch for the next day, because some things you do specifically to prove to yourself that you are still the person doing them. Margaret filed our response the following Monday: a formal objection to the guardianship petition, a request for forensic handwriting analysis of the signature on page 11, a motion to remove Stacy as a proposed co-trustee, and, this was Margaret's idea, and it was the sharpest one, a request that the hearing, already scheduled for the following month, proceed on its original date rather than being pushed back, because the petitioner has expressed urgency regarding the child's stability. And the respondent shares that urgency regarding resolution. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite your family's story using your own child's name as the argument, subscribe, you'll want to see how this one lands. Stacy did not know, through any of this, that we knew. That was Margaret's explicit instruction, and it was the hardest 3 weeks of quiet I have ever kept in my life. She continued living in my guest room. She continued making Eli's snacks, driving him to therapy, texting Marcus overseas cheerful updates about how well things were going here that Marcus forwarded to me with no comment except, once, a single line: almost home. Don't do anything alone. She continued, twice, to gently suggest at dinner that when Marcus gets back, maybe we should all sit down and talk about what's really best for Eli long term, her voice warm, reasonable, the voice of a woman who has convinced herself completely that she is the reasonable one in the room. I gave her, in a sense, the exit Margaret and I had discussed. On a Sunday 2 weeks before the hearing, I told her, calmly, over coffee at the kitchen table, that I had learned there was a guardianship filing with my name on it that I had not signed, and that I wanted to understand what had happened before this went any further than it needed to. I watched her face for the flicker I expected. It came and went in under 2 seconds, the same flicker Margaret later told me she has seen 100 times, right before a person decides to double down instead of confess. I was protecting Eli, Stacy said. You were never going to sign it, and I knew that, so I just helped it along. You'll thank me when you see how much smoother everything runs. You forged my name on a legal document and asked a court to give you control of my son's medical trust, I said. I did not raise my voice. If anything, I lowered it. I'm asking you, once, quietly, at this table, to withdraw the petition before the hearing. Nobody outside this kitchen needs to know how it happened. She stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor, and told me I had always been cold, that I had always thought I was too good for this family, that some people were born knowing how to love a child and some people just knew how to write reports about them. She did not withdraw the petition. She left the kitchen still wearing her rose perfume, and I sat at the table afterward and let myself feel, for exactly 1 private minute, the full weight of what it costs to be called a bad mother by the person raising your husband's flag on your porch. In the 10 days between Stacy walking out of that kitchen conversation and Marcus's flight landing in Phoenix, I had one more moment I am not proud of, the third and last one I'll admit to. Stacy did not move out of the guest room. Margaret had advised against forcing that issue before the hearing, since an eviction could be spun as instability of its own, and so for 10 days we lived in the same small house, passing each other in the hallway, her making Eli's snacks as though nothing had happened, me documenting the date of every strained, silent dinner. One night I stood in the shower long after the water had gone lukewarm, forehead against the tile, and thought seriously about calling Margaret and telling her to offer Stacy a quiet settlement instead, just withdraw the petition, no charges, no courtroom, let it die in a filing cabinet the way I kept my own folder. It would have been so much easier. Nobody but the 4 of us would ever have had to know a grandmother tried to forge her way into a 9-year-old's trust fund. I stood in that water until it ran fully cold before I turned it off, because some part of me already understood that easier and right were not, this time, the same direction. Marcus came home 9 days before the hearing, tanned and thinner and smelling like jet fuel and airport coffee instead of solar sealant, and when I handed him the folder at our kitchen table, the real one this time, at home, not the manila one at school, he read it twice without speaking, and then he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, something between grief and resolve. "She's my mother," he said. "I need you to know that saying what I'm about to say costs me something. But she doesn't get to do this to either of you and still get to be in this house." That was his line. That was the permission that mattered most, not because I needed his blessing to defend our son, but because a man choosing his wife and child over the mother who raised him, out loud, at his own kitchen table, is not a small thing, and I will not pretend it was. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in the Coconino County Superior Court, Judge Renata Cho presiding, a woman in her 60s known around the county for reading every page of every filing before she ever asked a single question in the courtroom. Stacy had invited witnesses. That detail, when Margaret told me, made something in my chest go still in a different way than fear. Stacy had asked her sister, her pastor from the church on Route 89A, and two of her longtime friends from the motel days to attend in support of the family, clearly expecting a room full of people who would see a grandmother fighting for a grandchild against a cold, career-focused mother. She had built her own stage. She simply had not checked who else would be standing on it. The gallery was maybe 20 people deep, Stacy's sister in a floral dress, her pastor with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, two friends I recognized from old photographs at Stacy's house. Marcus sat beside me in his one good suit, the same one he'd worn to his father's funeral 11 years earlier, still slightly too big in the shoulders, and behind us, arriving 5 minutes before the docket opened, was Renata Delgado from the Pediatric Neurology Office, subpoenaed as a records custodian, her gray hair pinned back, a single manila folder of her own on her lap. The room smelled like every courtroom smells, floor polish and old wood and the particular hush of recycled air, and somewhere down the hall a copier hummed like it was clearing its throat before the hearing. I had worn the same navy blazer I wear to IEP meetings. I expect to be difficult, the one with a single button I can fasten without thinking about it, because I have learned over 11 years that when your hands need something to do, a button is a small, private anchor. Margaret sat beside me with her legal pad squared exactly parallel to the table edge, 3 exhibits already tabbed in colored flags, and she leaned over once, before the bailiff called the room to order, and said only, "You don't have to say anything today unless the judge asks you a direct question. Let the paper talk first." I nodded. My hands were cold. I did not let them shake. Stacy walked in 4 minutes after us, in the navy dress I recognized from Easter services, her sister's arm looped through hers, and for one unguarded second, before she arranged her face for the room, I saw something in her that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of a person who has decided, completely, that she is doing the right thing and is finally about to be allowed to prove it in front of people who matter to her. I want to be honest that seeing that expression on her face, even knowing everything I knew, cost me something. Some small, stubborn part of me still wanted, even then, for this to somehow turn out to be a misunderstanding we could all walk back from over coffee. Stacy's attorney, a younger man named Curtis Ambrose, who I later learned had taken the case as a favor to her pastor and had, before that morning, never once handled a contested guardianship matter, opened by describing a family in crisis, a mother stretched thin by a demanding profession, a grandmother stepping selflessly into the gap. He said the word stability 4 times in 6 minutes, and I noticed, in the particular clinical way I notice things when I am too frightened to feel them properly, that he never once used the word forgery or the word trust, as if avoiding both terms entirely might keep the judge from noticing they existed in the file at all. Stacy sat at the petitioner's table in a navy dress I recognized from church, her hands folded, her face arranged into an expression of patient, wounded love, the same expression she wears in the photograph on her mantle from the year she was named Employee of the Month at the motel, 20-some years ago, a woman who has always understood, on some level, exactly how she wanted to be seen. Margaret rose when it was our turn, and she did not raise her voice either. That surprised Curtis Ambrose. I think he had clearly prepared for a fight, and what he got instead was a woman removing her glasses, setting them on the table, and speaking in the exact even register she uses to read a due process ruling out loud. "Your Honor, the petitioner's filing rests on a document that Mrs. Holt did not sign," Margaret said. "I would like to submit, as Exhibit A, a certified copy of the original petition. I would like to submit, as Exhibit B, the notary log from the UPS store on Milton Road, showing the notarization occurred at 2:47 p.m. on September the 24th. And I would like to submit, as Exhibit C, the sign-in log from Sinagua Elementary School, showing Mrs. Holt present and teaching a math small group at that exact time, on that exact date, 31 miles from the location where her signature was allegedly witnessed. The clerk stamped each exhibit as it was handed up, and the sound of that stamp, 3 flat, unhurried thumps, was, I think, the loudest sound in the room, though it was not loud at all. Judge Cho read each page slowly. She did not look up until she reached the end of Exhibit A, and when she did look up, it was not at Margaret or at me. It was at Stacy. Mrs. Plum, she said, were you present when this signature was applied to page 11 of your petition? Stacy's sister, in the second row, made a small sound, not quite a gasp, more like a held breath released too fast. Curtis Ambrose leaned toward his client and murmured something. Stacy looked, for the first time all morning, at the exhibit in the judge's hand rather than at anyone's face. I want the record to reflect, Margaret continued, before anyone else could speak, that a second filing in this same petition requests co-trustee status over $180,000 held in a special needs trust established for the minor child's medical care following a birth injury settlement. The petitioner's own filing specifies future disbursements would require her signature. That was the number that changed the temperature of the room. I felt it change, the particular shift you feel in a parent-teacher conference the moment a mother realizes the meeting was never really about the reading log. Stacy's pastor, in the third row, took his glasses off his forehead and put them on properly, as if he needed to see something more clearly than he had a moment ago. Curtis Ambrose asked for a recess. Judge Cho denied it. I've read the exhibits, counsel. I don't need a recess to ask your client a direct question. Mrs. Plum, did you sign your daughter-in-law's name to this petition? I did not raise my voice, sitting there. If anything, my whole body went quieter than it had been in weeks, the specific stillness that settles over you when a thing you have been carrying finally sets itself down on a table other than your own. Stacy stood, gripping the edge of the petitioner's table, and for a moment I watched 32 years of my husband's family history rearrange itself behind her eyes. I did it for him, she said, and her voice, for the first time all morning, actually shook. I did it because I have spent my whole life watching people decide things about children without asking anyone who actually loved them, and I was not going to let that happen to my grandson. Somebody in that family needed to be able to act. She's gone all day at that school with other people's children, and I am the one who's here. She looked at me then, not at the judge. I grew up with nobody making a single decision in my favor, not once, not one time, and I swore no child of mine would ever sit in that same chair. I know how it looks. I am telling you why. Nobody in that gallery said a word. Her pastor had both hands folded now, not in prayer exactly, more the way you fold your hands when you are watching something you cannot stop. I felt, in that moment, something I had not expected to feel and did not enjoy feeling, a flicker of grief for the frightened girl in a cottonwood trailer who had grown into a woman who still believed the only way to protect anyone was to take the decision away from them entirely, on paper, in a stranger's handwriting. Judge Cho did not raise her voice either. Courtrooms rarely need anyone to. Mrs. Plum, I understand you believe your intentions were good. Intentions do not authorize forgery, and they do not authorize an attempt to gain financial control over a minor's protected trust. This petition is denied in full. I am referring this matter to the county attorney's office for review of possible forgery and attempted fraud charges. Mrs. Holt retains sole physical and legal custody, as she is held from the beginning of this proceeding, because nothing in this filing has ever actually been in question except the paper used to challenge it. The gavel did not slam. Judges rarely slam gavels the way television suggests. Judge Cho simply set it down, the way you set down a pen after signing the last line of a form, and the sound of it landing on the wood was somehow more final than any raised voice could have been. If this hit close to home, if you have ever had someone try to love your child by taking a decision away from you instead of asking you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the paper always tells the truth eventually. The aftermath unfolded slowly, the way real consequences usually do, without a single dramatic scene to close it out. The Coconino County Attorney's Office reviewed the notary log, Renata Delgado's testimony, and the handwriting analysis Margaret had commissioned from a certified document examiner in Phoenix, who confirmed with 94% confidence that the signature on page 11 did not match 7 verified samples of my handwriting and did, in 6 of 8 measured characteristics, match Stacy Plum's. Stacy was charged with 1 count of forgery and 1 count of attempted fraud related to the trust filing. She pled guilty 11 weeks later to a reduced single count, avoiding trial, and received 18 months of supervised probation, 400 hours of restitution-adjacent community service at a senior center in Cottonwood, and a formal order barring her from any future role as guardian, trustee, or fiduciary for Eli, entered permanently into the county record. Devin, the young notary at the UPS store, kept his job. His manager told Margaret, when she followed up, that the store had since implemented a policy requiring photo ID verification for every notarization regardless of how well the notary believes they know the signer. Renata Delgado received a formal letter of appreciation from the county attorney's office for flagging the records request in the first place, which she keeps, she told me later, laughing, in the drawer with my expired coupons, because that's about the weight I give it, but it was nice of them. Marcus and Stacy have spoken twice since the hearing, both times briefly, both times at his initiative, not mine. He visits her occasionally, alone, at the senior center where she now volunteers 3 afternoons a week folding towels and reading to residents with dementia, a detail that Margaret pointed out, gently, is either genuine penance or the same instinct that started all of this, rerouted toward people who can no longer fight back. I don't know which it is. I have decided I don't need to know in order to keep my distance. Eli, for what it's worth, asked about Grandma Stacy exactly twice in the months afterward, in the specific literal way he asks about anything that changes without warning, and I answered him the way I answer any question from any child in my classroom whose home has just rearranged itself, honestly, at the level he could hold, without more detail than he needed. Grandma made a big mistake with some paperwork, and now she can't help make decisions for you anymore. That's not because you did anything wrong. He nodded, the way he nods when an answer satisfies the shape of the question, and went back to lining up his dinosaurs by color, which is, more or less, exactly what I wanted for him. Renata Delgado still calls the house sometimes, months later, just to check in, which is not something a records custodian is required to do for anyone, and I have come to think of her the way I think of the good paraprofessionals I have worked beside for years, the ones who notice a discrepancy on a Tuesday and quietly refuse to let it slide, not because it's their job exactly, but because it's who they are. Walt Pruitt next door has never mentioned the guardianship again, though he did, that first Thanksgiving afterward, leave a foil-wrapped plate of his wife's tamales on our porch with a sticky note of his own that just said, "Glad things settled." I keep meaning to tell him how close his sticky note came to matching mine, hidden that whole autumn in my sock drawer, and I never quite have. Margaret's bill for the whole matter, from the first phone call to the final order entered into the record, came to just under $9,000, most of it covered, eventually, by a restitution order the court attached to Stacy's probation, for $100 a month for the better part of 2 years. It is not the kind of number that undoes anything. It simply closed a ledger that needed closing, the way every real resolution eventually has to show up as a number on a page instead of a feeling in a room. The trust remains exactly where it was always meant to be, administered by a licensed fiduciary in Phoenix neither Marcus nor I can touch directly, disbursing quarterly for Eli's therapies, his adaptive equipment, and someday, his adult support services, the way it was built to from the very beginning by people who understood, better than any of us did at the time, that the safest money is the money nobody in the family can reach in a moment of fear. Marcus and I have talked, since, about what it means that his mother's love and his mother's fear turned out, in the end, to be made of the exact same material, just aimed in a direction none of us saw coming until it was already filed with a court. He does not defend what she did. He has stopped trying to explain it away, though some nights I still catch him standing at the kitchen window with his coffee going cold, looking out at the ponderosa pines the way a person looks at something they are still, quietly, grieving. I let him have that. Grief and accountability, I have learned, are allowed to sit at the same table. The trust remains exactly where it was always meant to be, administered by a licensed fiduciary in Phoenix. Neither Marcus nor I can touch directly, disbursing quarterly for Eli's therapies, his adaptive equipment, and someday, his adult support services, the way it was built to from the very beginning by people who understood, better than any of us did at the time, that the safest money is the money nobody in the family can reach in a moment of fear. I still keep a folder at school. It has nothing frightening in it anymore, just old photocopies I have never quite found the nerve to throw away, the sign-in sheet, the notary log, the certified petition with its careful forged R that almost matched mine. I look at it sometimes on a slow afternoon, not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me of something I already knew from 11 years of writing goals for other people's children and somehow needed to relearn for my own. Nobody gets to decide, on your behalf and in your handwriting, what your family needs. Not out of love. Not out of fear. Not even out of 32 years of history that deserved, and never got, a better ending than a courtroom. I have spent 11 years teaching other people's children that a good plan is written down, dated, and signed by the people who actually have the right to sign it. It took my own family to teach me that the reverse is just as true, that the moment somebody signs your name for you, whatever they call it, is the moment you stop asking what they meant and start asking what they're after. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me what stayed with you. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one, told the way they actually happened, calm and clear, right down to the last page. I'll see you in the next one.